Hi, welcome to Academics of PA.
Hey, how's it going?
Hi, Bruce. Thanks for being here. We are still recording live from the Midwest Public Affairs Conference, and we are here with Levin Daniel.
Hello.
Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So we asked Jamie to do the podcast because she was just first author on a really interesting paper that we think has a lot of relevance for the field and for our audience. But why don't you start talking about how you came to the field of public administration?
I was working in Jewish communal service, which ends up being relevant to how this article came about. And our organization went through a big change. I was working for a nonprofit and I got sent down a path of, I don't know what change management is. I didn't know it was a thing, but turns out it is. And that's what I ended up studying and pursuing an MBA. And while doing that at Ohio State, I got connected to the Glenn School of Public Affairs, now the Glenn College of Public Affairs. But I ended up meeting Dr. Stephanie Moulton and Dr. Trevor Brown and really got connected into the nonprofit side of things and the public affairs side of things that really tapped into some of my questions. So I come at it as a management scholar, as an organization scholar, but that's how I came to the field.
Wonderful. And where are you now?
I am here at IUPUI in Indianapolis, Indiana.
So do you call it IUPUI or UUPUI?
Yeah, no, you can't say UUPUI. No. It is IUPUI. And we are the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at IUPUI.
Ooey pooey is funny, though.
Ooey pooey is funny, and I think that's the reason why we're not supposed to use it. I know it's like the NCAA March Madness acronym whenever we make it into the tournament, but no, they're very clear, IUPUI.
Wonderful. So you recently wrote a paper. Can you tell us a little bit about where it is, how we could find it?
Sure. So I wrote this paper with my two colleagues, Rachel Fyall and Jodi Benenson. It's titled Talking About Antisemitism in MPA Classrooms and Beyond. And it is published at the Journal of Public Affairs Education. And it is online. Public Affairs or Public Administration?
Public Affairs. We used to be Public Administration.
Okay. Woof.
They changed their name back in 97.
Just had a momentary panic. So it's published at JPay. It is online already. And if you have any issues accessing it, just send me an email and I will hook you up with a copy.
Well, why don't you talk a little bit about your motivation for writing that particular piece?
Or maybe before motivation, what was the piece about?
Hopefully somewhat self-explanatory from the title. But really, what we were looking for was to create a resource of how to talk about anti-Semitism. And we kept going back and forth. We're like, how to teach anti-Semitism, but we don't want to teach anti-Semitism. We want to teach how to combat it or how to address it. But what we were really trying to do was, this ties into the motivation, but I think it'll set the stage a little bit better. The Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh happened on October 27th, 2018. And Rachel, who has been a dear friend and colleague and co-author, emailed me and said, how are you going to talk about this in your classroom? And I know why. Like I said, I was a Jewish communal professional. I've sort of been the professional Jew. Even in high school, I was, more observant and more vocal and active in youth group and all of that. But I looked at her email and was like, I don't know. I don't know how I'm going to talk about this. I've struggled with how to address these types of issues and not make them about me, because you shouldn't care it shouldn't matter to you just because you know me or you know someone who's Jewish. That can be the hook. That can be the way to personalize it. But this is a deeper issue and a more fundamental issue that has broader implications for public and nonprofit management. And so the paper is really, here's why you should care. Here's some language around anti-Semitism. And then here are some things you can do in your classrooms and in your departments and on your campuses to address these issues. Sadly, the article keeps being super relevant. Things are happening all the time, and newspaper articles and statements from public leaders, public servants, all these things that keep highlighting why this is an important resource. So we just basically created the resource we thought had existed, but clearly didn't. And, it was the thing we wish we could have Googled and found on, late October.
Have you ever written about your identity or religion in an academic piece before?
Nope, not in an academic piece. Like I said, I've barely admitted it in the classroom before. I have brought it up in faculty meetings for calendar issues, which we can get to. The closest that I've come to connecting my academic and my religious identity is Hannah Lebovits has a blog, and part of it focuses on academic parents. And I wrote a piece last fall about trying to juggle calendar and syllabus planning in the fall when the holidays always move around. So that was the sort of the closest that I've come to sort of marrying the two identities. But that was, a blog for, a friend and colleague and nothing academic. This hadn't even entered. I research how nonprofits get the resources they need to do what they do and how that acquisition affects their services. There's nothing in this space, and not even Jewish organizations. So,
and I think that is common, right? I think most of the academic world and in public administration don't always bring together their identity and their research. Yet I think it was a really timely piece. I think it was a really important piece. And to me, it sort of sparks, though, why isn't there more of that?
Because it's scary. I mean, that's one reason.
Yeah. So why is it scary?
Because I'm putting myself out there and clearly in a population that has been targeted. So I'm kind of putting this out there as I'm Jewish. We had a lot of conversations. Rachel was really the one who kicked us all off and started this idea. And, Jodi, who's also been a friend and colleague, it was a really logical move to bring her on board, given her experience and perspective. But, we had conversations about who was going to be first author and what that would mean and who would want to be more out there with it or felt somewhat comfortable. And I will say that even, we went through this process, we knew it was important. But when we got the official notification from JPay that it was accepted, I kind of went, oh my God, oh crap. It's out there, right? In a very public way. And people who are out there publicly, there was an article the other day about someone on the app Telegram compiling lists of Jews who are public, and lists of Jews definitely don't go well in our history. So, and it's nothing that I research. It may turn into part of a research agenda, but it's nothing that I research. I'm a untenured junior woman in academia. There's just a lot that was like, oh, this is a thing. This is
right, the idea that it seems risky.
It does, right, and it does seem risky, and it also we talk about this in the piece. A lot of times things get scheduled on Jewish holidays. And I have to Google every year when Rosh Hashanah is, because it's a movable feast. I know it's in the fall. It's going to change every year because of the lunar calendar. But even that's not a foreign concept. Easter is a movable feast. It changes every day. And it's just automatically on your calendars already. So I get people not really knowing, but get in the habit of looking at a calendar before scheduling, community events or university related events or faculty meetings and things like that, because it gets frustrating to just have to be like, can we reschedule? Because that's a Jewish holiday. And it starts to feel like that's the only thing that I'm saying. And the interesting thing is, so the way that we wrote the piece, we have some personal narrative in there that is sort of our voice, giving voice to our experience so that people can understand the implications and the effects that this issue has on us. And going back, when I looked back at the piece recently, I couldn't necessarily remember which reflections I had written and which ones came initially from Jodi and Rachel, because sadly, our experiences were common for us and I think for other colleagues who are Jewish who have experienced this. And so it was kind of like, oh, did I write that? Or was that Rachel's? I don't even remember at this point.
Flip side, that piece is so interesting because it talks about the diversity of Judaism, right? And that it is not this one thing that you are or can be or a way you practice. And sometimes that gets wrapped up into a feeling of how you're treated in society. But I want to go back. So it is a critical theory. It has personal perspective. Mm-hmm. And I think as academics, that just in itself is very different. I might ask Bruce, why was JPay so excited about what is a very different type of piece?
It was very different than how normally things go. So whenever anything is submitted, Wynn Decker, who's our editorial assistant, assigns it to one of either Will or myself, based on whoever has the fewest things in their inbox at any given point in time. And so it went into Will's box, and about 2 hours later, I had a message from him on Facebook going, "We have to accept this." And I was like, "Wait, what are you talking about?" So I then go into the system and look at it, and I was like, well, it's a really interesting paper. And I was like, well, we're still supposed to send stuff through peer review. And he goes, well, who can we actually get to peer review it? And so we then went back and forth. And finally, we went into the editorial board like, well, here's a piece we know we eventually want to accept because it has a place in the discussion And I think part of the thing that Will and I like for JPay is some of the conversations that have kind of been in the background in terms of managing and running and being in academia. We are much more willing to kind of go, let's have the conversation. And so we're like, well, this is definitely a thing. Let's have the conversation. And so we actually had the editorial board help us find reviewers for it. In part, we didn't want to go. And one, reviewers are generally, and I apologize if anybody listening has been a reviewer, are generally not very nice. They're generally assholes. There is no nice way of kind of saying that. And so there was the concern, one, that we pick somebody who's going to go on that side. There was the concern to go, okay, well, who's has enough understanding from the community to actually be able to provide interesting or useful feedback. And I admit there's a couple people who I know who are Jewish, but I also felt, I was like, well, I don't want to be like, we're asking you to review it purely because you're Jewish, because that doesn't seem right either.
Right. And do you need to be to understand the value of the work, of the contribution? Maybe you need to be decidedly not Jewish to be able to appreciate what this provides.
Yeah.
I don't know what I would do.
We made this point in the acknowledgements, but the care with which you guys as editors and the reviewers who may or may not be listening to this treated the manuscript really came through. We had concerns about how it was going to be received, even just the structure and the way that we went about it. And, the comments that we got back were really helpful and generally positive and sort of recognizing what we were trying to do. Some of them helped us give name, like this idea, some of the rhetorical devices that we were using and how they fit with critical theory, and some of the citations even that came from the reviewers. We were like, oh yeah, that's what we were doing. Sure. It just felt sort of the best way for us to get it out. Didn't know that some of that had, because again, none of us are critical theorists or would say that that's our main focus at all. And so it was a really, for what it was and for sort of how important and somewhat risky it felt, JPay was a really great experience for that.
I think there's so much of what we do when we research, it's things we're passionate about, but there's that distance between ourselves and it. And so we also...
Yeah, there was no distance here.
And so trying to make sure that we approach that with the same kind of caution and respect, that we don't want to be like, oh, well, the things that are that doesn't matter. We only care about the other side of stuff.
Well, you asked if I'd written about this before, and I was like, I don't even know that I've really used the word I in research, right? Because even if I'm working on a solo authored piece, we don't say I. The closest we come is the plural we. We did this or we analyzed that. So yeah, I don't know that I've ever used the word I in a published piece before like that.
So both of you have sort of said the time was right. I mean, I think it was timely because of the news, but why is this happening now in public administration? Why are we starting to recognize that, one, we need to have hard conversations about a range of topics, but that our journals can be an outlet to learn about these things? I don't think we've thought about them that way.
I think there are a couple of things. I don't know sort of what's the chicken and what's the egg, right? But I think, there are journals like ATP. There are journals that have calls for critical theory. There's something in the water, right, that is recognizing the value and that this is where people are. This is where a lot of researchers are. I think there's also intersectionality is a loaded word, especially when it comes to Jews and Israel and similar issues. But this recognition, the way that we framed our core argument about why this matters wasn't about being Jewish. It's about sort of any sort of marginalized population or population that is not part of the majority, and how, we want to be able to Mary Guy's point, who she spoke at MPAC yesterday in her keynote and said that people, in order to be effective, people have to feel like they can trust government. And I think we thought people have to feel like they can see themselves, or at least see allies. And so our core argument about why this matters is the ability to critique technical rationality. What Balfour and Adams talk about is the administrative evil. So bringing humanity back into conversations, demonstrating cultural competence. We serve increasingly diverse populations. We work with increasingly diverse workforces to do so. Our communities are increasingly diverse. So being able to cater to that and engendering trust and demonstrating ethical approaches to government. And so that has nothing to do with anti-Semitism specifically, but anti-Semitism is one thing that gets in the way of those aspects of providing public service. And so our case is you could use those three arguments about why this matters to talk about Islamophobia, to talk about sexism, to talk about a lot of these different issues, there's a through line through that. An argument was, this is why these types of conversations matter in general. We are going to give you specific language around anti-Semitism because that resource doesn't exist. So, but you could take that framework and apply it. I mean, I did in class in the spring. I talked about it. Honestly, I don't remember in which anti-Semitic incident this was in response to, but it was something. And I used it to break down the incident with my class. But the next week we were talking about the current event that came up was the shooting in Christchurch. And so I was able to talk about and say, hey, remember we talked about cultural competence and trust. Remember, well, the Prime Minister of New Zealand wore a headscarf signaling, acknowledging norms, and talked about how the scene needed to be processed. And she recognized Muslim burial rites that require quick burials within 24 hours. And they weren't going to be able to do that, but at least she acknowledged that that was placing a burden on the community, or at least, an attempt to recognize a community need. So our framework is sort of like, this is why these conversations matter in general.
Yeah, the framing of cultural competence, right? It's part of NASPA. We work in a public environment, right? That it is diverse and is aware. So what do we want our students to understand about cultural competence? And what is our role in creating that? And I think you try to, like you say, do it in that context of anti-Semitism. But without a piece like this, what were we doing, right? Where was the conversation going? Did we address it? And I'm going to say I don't. I think I talk about what's going on. I mention cultural events. I ask people that I am interested in what they believe and what they do and their lifestyle. And I try to show respect for it. But do I engage my students in conversations about how to grow their own cultural competence other than maybe trying to model it somewhat? No, I don't.
It's not really an argument, but a very heated discussion that Jade Berry James and I have had going back and forth. Within my own department, we have a class in cultural competency, but the only people who actually take it, it's an elective class. So you have a lot of minorities will take the class and nobody else does. And so we've had this whole argument kind of going back and forth between, should it be a required course or should you have aspects of the course be implemented into kind of every other class? Because think about budgeting. There's a degree of cultural competency, the degree of social equity that you have to talk about because of the needs of different groups. And so the people who are experiencing issues of cultural competency that arise are getting it, and a lot of other people aren't necessarily getting it.
Yeah, I think cultural competencies are in some ways an end, like a skill to build. And in some ways, they're also a means to an end and part of the bigger conversation about what assumptions are we bringing to the table? How are these assumptions shaping the decisions that we make regarding what we teach and what our students take away and how that informs their work? So, anyone who follows me on Twitter or has read my book review for JPay knows I love the Reframing Nonprofits book. And that, to me, it's part of that bigger conversation of what assumptions are we making for nonprofits, but also in the public space. And how can we make sure that those assumptions are robust and inclusive? And we can't do that if we don't have an awareness and an ability to use cultural competencies and to demonstrate that.
Yeah. So what advice do you give in the article to the public administration professor to talk about and develop competence?
So we have a couple of different ways. One is sort of depending on what your class is. There's a way to talk about, like if you are teaching a research methods class or something focused on data collection, you can look at how you're surveying your populations, or even when, if you're out collecting surveys on a Friday night or Saturday or calling people, you're going to miss a chunk of the population. We're talking about HR. You can look at toolkits. There's examples of racial toolkits or race-based toolkits and things like that certain cities have employed. But similarly, like how do you schedule things? What are your religious accommodations? Does your company have a policy of religious accommodations? Nobody has to take off for Christmas or Easter, but do your Jewish employees have to use PTO to take off for Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, which people often shorthand as like the equivalent of Christmas and Easter? I mean, there are two high holy days. There are a lot of other holidays, but point being, you never have to worry unless you're an asterisk. If you're a doctor, if you're in an industry that's on call 24/7, that's a little bit different, but everybody's treated equal. Doctors have to work on Christmas, etc. So things like even that assumption, nobody thinks about the calendar, right? It's just how it always is. Of course we don't. The flip side, I was in Israel for part of the summer and the work week is Sunday to Thursday. So I had this experience. I was working with a colleague and, I emailed him and hadn't heard from him within a day and emailed him back just being like, hey, did you get this? And then later I texted him. I said, I just realized yesterday was Sunday. So of course you wouldn't have seen it because it was your weekend. Here it starts on Sunday. He was like, I never would have even thought about that. And I said, well, when you have a Jewish majority that can set the calendar, that sort of works in our favor. So yeah, I think there are some things like that, thinking about, again, assumptions and calendars. So that's the HR side. Looking, when you're talking about policy, you can look at how policies are used to target certain people, redlining, things like that. That's a history that many people aren't aware of. I think one of the key takeaways that I had in setting up this research was, and sort of grounding it was, we just looked up anti-Semitism in the top public and nonprofit journals. It's mentioned approximately 10 times, usually in conjunction to the Holocaust, which makes it sound like, oh, we've dealt with anti-Semitism, just like, oh yeah, we're post-racial, right? Like that's not the case, and neither of those are true in any way, shape, or form. And so, that was the thing that stuck out.
I feel weird saying it's interesting that it's only there, but if you think, well, it's one thing to go into a classroom, or in anything in a faculty and be like, okay, well, you can tell, on a racial basis, a little bit of what's going on, the differences. And so like, that's easy to kind of sit there and keep in mind and keep track of. And, anything else you have to go back and go, well, okay, well, what's your religion? Well, that's something that you're not supposed to really go ask people because it's very personal.
How do you make the invisible visible? Right. Without putting a burden on that population or without putting a target, right? But how do you find that balance to signal you recognize the diversity might be in the room? So for example, it's not like I walk in wearing a giant Jewish star and just like talking about all this stuff, but I will say to my students, oh, I don't have office hours next week because it's Rosh Hashanah. Or, I'll email them and say, if you want feedback on something before it's due, you have to email me by noon on the 29th because I won't be available for the next 2 days. And so kind of trying to work it in that way. And so it's just sort of, I'm not hiding it. I'm not making it a big thing either, but it's just sort of, this is how it affects me. And this is how, therefore, it affects you.
Yeah. And right. So because you're open, maybe other
Exactly.
feel more open.
Right. Or a student might feel comfortable asking for a religious accommodation for if they're Jewish or if they see that I'm open to it. I had one student last year who gave me a heads up that he would be leaving to pray because he was Muslim and, they pray 5 times a day. And so, or at least that was his practice. And so I was like, great, thanks for letting me know, and I appreciate that because I wasn't left with, why does he keep getting up in the middle of class, right? Like it sort of set the pace. And I don't know if it was because I had made a disclosure or what it was, but that cleared any sort of ambiguity for me as to why a student was randomly getting up.
What can someone do that doesn't identify strongly with a particular culture or religion that wants to signal the same type of openness?
Being, I think, especially open, things like for instructors, marking dates on syllabi, on the calendar, even putting Rosh Hashanah in quotes. Google and Microsoft Outlook both have filters that you can add to your calendars. So it's not hard to figure out. Granted, if you add the Jewish holidays, there's like a zillion of them in the fall. So feel free to ask a colleague or, me or someone like which ones are the ones that people are likely to observe. But I think there are ways of saying that, of calling attention to if you have a religious accommodation language, making sure it's in your syllabus. In terms of faculty, don't make the Jewish person comment on a calendar conflict. Like I have great colleagues here who are now pretty good at checking calendars and stepping in for me and saying something or recognizing that something is an issue. Granted, it's hard to know what incidents are going to really land and resonate with people because it feels like there are a lot of anti-Semitic incidents and things like the shooting, the Pittsburgh shooting, things like last year, my synagogue got tagged with a giant swastika and Iron Cross. There was a swastika in Noblesville 30 minutes away over Labor Day weekend. Just getting texts like that say, hey, heard about this. Like, people suck. Sorry. But it's just like, hey, we see you and we know. Because I think this is actually something where Jodi, Rachel, and I are working on a piece for the conversation about taking this down even more out of the classroom and making even clear that, anti-Semitism has costs for public and nonprofit service delivery and consumption, right? If you're talking about in the Jewish communal world, you're talking about energy and resources to come up with security plans. Who's going to pay for that? Again, the high holidays start September 29th. This is a major focus and not really what should be the focus right now, but it's on the minds of clergy. It's on the minds of congregation members. You also have, for example, I'm Jewish. I'm not working in a Jewish organization, but there's a cost to it. There's a mental cost that does impact, sometimes when we were working on this piece, I couldn't really do a lot. I'd have to come home and watch Buffy or something to decompress. And then you have people who, if they are, if you're a member of a resident of the town in New Jersey, or I actually think it was 2 towns where the council members used the phrase "Jew them down." Do you really feel like you are represented? Yeah, this happened over the last week. Do you really feel like your interests are represented and that you can trust your government representatives to make decisions in your choice? So that has implications for service delivery and consumption.
Yeah, that's an economy I'm checking out of, right?
Yeah. Why should I participate? Why should I feel trusted? Why? And then it's a cycle where if you remove yourself, then if people don't have access to you, it can perpetuate stereotypes because you're removing yourself from the conversation, potentially rightfully so. But it's a whole cycle of effects and isolation and whatnot. So, and I don't think, we didn't even say it this plainly in our piece, but that was the goal behind this is please recognize that these have effects. The other one thing I don't want to forget to say is that one of the interesting findings, Jews make up about 1.8 to 2% of the US population, depending on which survey you look at. But approximately 10% of American adults have agreed with or expressed anti-Semitic attitudes, according to ADL and some of the other surveys that are out there, which means you might have Jewish students in your class. You may also have students who have been known to identify with anti-Semitic attitudes, which also shapes service. So there are multiple reasons why these are important things to be teaching our students.
So I'm comparing, you're talking about the high holidays coming up and the security. My parents' neighbor's church, so not the church my parents go to, is a Baptist church, and they have several retired police officers who stay in guard at the church so no one can attack them. And I'm like, no one's trying to attack your church, but they are so concerned that that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, my nephew had a bar mitzvah, and the congregation, the doors were basically locked. There was someone standing there, and if they knew you or you were a family member, you got in. And they had a car with they didn't even have a security service. They had a decal for a car, right? So that was sitting in just to send signals. But it's, the synagogue that I grew up with in Cleveland is really big. And it's really, I remember a couple of years ago to see if we could get tickets because we were going to be there for Rosh Hashanah. And it was a whole thing about you were going to park in this lot or in that lot. And it's a giant service. And they use the Greek church parking lot. It's a whole production. And I couldn't even figure out how to get tickets if I wanted to. And then I went on to the other synagogue and it was like, oh yeah, we have 2 services, one with a choir and one without childcare in both buildings. Come. And it's been that way for a couple of years, but I don't know if that's going to change it didn't change last year, although that was before the shooting. I don't think it's changed according to their website, but I wouldn't have been surprised if it had. And that, again, you want to welcome people into your congregation. The whole point is to be welcoming. And yet, how do you balance all those things?
I mean, the church, it's very much the security because they're trying to keep certain people out.
Right.
It's not that someone's trying to attack them.
Yeah.
North Florida, it's basically like the deep south. It's very, very different than everybody else. But I mean, it's at the same time, no one's trying to attack them. It's the idea of religion's supposed to be open. I can't imagine trying to go to a church or a synagogue or a mosque anywhere where you are trying to express religion at the same time also then being fearful that someone's trying to come in and violently keep you from doing that.
There's an image on Twitter that's making the rounds of a synagogue, I think in Michigan, and it has the 2 prayer books that 2 of the prayer books that are commonly used. And in the middle is a pamphlet about what to do in an active shooter situation. And for those who don't know, Rosh Hashanah is the New Year. Yom Kippur is the holiest day. It's the Day of Atonement. The 10 days in between are considered the high holy days. It's the most spiritual time. And for a lot of people, it may be the only time that they go to services, or they may not want to this year because they don't necessarily feel comfortable or don't want to feel like they're being made to be a target. My daughter's in daycare at the JCC. the number of emails we've gotten about there were anti-Semitic flyers posted last week. Here's what we're doing about it. There were that actually literally happened last week. In response to, incidents that happen either locally or, not locally, but they know parents are going to be asking or members are going to be asking. It's like crazy.
Without diminishing that true threat and how scary that is, I still think that idea of very few people will go to that extreme, but there are many people from that survey research that live with stereotypes and unkind ideas. And so it is those folks that the public administration classroom can have the most effect on, right? Because if we talk about it and then our students talk about it, that really has that cycle to keep it going, to be shared, and then, to truly make people comfortable in the workplace long term. Right, to have more awareness, more comfort around people with differences, people who are different.
Well, I mean, everybody pretends that the U.S. is, the white nation of, I'm not going to say like the Aryan nation, but we are very, the classic American perspective, but that's not who we are and that's not who lives here.
Right.
We've never really been that. We are a place of lots of different
yeah, people will say we're a Christian nation, right?
That's what I was looking for.
Yeah. So I didn't mean to jump on your sentence, but like that's what when you were saying that I'm like, and immediately I'm like, no, we're not.
No, and the founding fathers are very explicit in making sure that it wasn't.
Right. It's definitely a challenge, especially if you have people who that is their belief in sort of guiding values in terms of how they deliver public service or how they approach their work.
Well, we were talking before about different communities, right? So some communities having more diversity and people growing up with more diversity and coming to public service and being more comfortable. And then there are communities that are totally different. And I think your piece is particularly helpful for MPA professors broadly, right? Because you have to talk about it in both places. It's important in both places, but it's going to be a little bit harder in others, I think. And for some professors who haven't even had that experience. And so being pushed to talk about it, recognizing that you can talk about it, here are skills and tools to talk about it.
And again, I think we gave language and tips specifically about anti-Semitism because that was our need. We were filling our own needs first, but you could swap out anti-Semitism or swap out Jews in the paper and put in other populations and the same approaches would work. So again, we really think the conversations about anti-Semitism are really relevant because again, there's just incidents all over from our president, from people in public office, from people who deliver nonprofit services, from a lot of places. It's very, very relevant and timely and people may have more exposure, but these are ways of thinking about these difficult conversations that it doesn't necessarily have to be about anti-Semitism. We wanted anti-Semitism on the radar because clearly it wasn't, at least from the perspective of the field. But that's why we wrote the article that we wrote that was like, take this front section. Here's why these types of conversations matter. And if you're probably going to need to be able to talk about anti-Semitism because of all the things that keep happening. But here are ways to talk about these other challenging subjects as well.
So I'll pick on Rosemary OLeary a little bit. Last spring when we had our episode with her, she was talking about how she chooses the research topics that she works on. And she's going through and there's this thing over here that's kind of an interest to me, this thing over here. But the ones that have made most of a difference, it doesn't matter what it is, are the things that have a direct impact or have directly impacted her, those close to her in some way.
Yeah. I don't know if this will be like our most cited piece because it's more of a teaching tool, but I think it'll be my most read piece and the piece that potentially has the most impact in terms of how people think and have some of these conversations. And again, like it's sort of come full circle coming from the Jewish community and communal services to being a professor, not really owning that identity to like, nope, it's out there. Like that's who I am. So it's really interesting. Like I thought I'd set out to answer questions about nonprofits.
Are you happy about that? I mean, I could see feeling still very conflicted, right? That if you try to make your career doing a certain type of work, I mean, I really think you had to be stronger than others to choose to do this, to put yourself out there, to take that risk. And I almost feel like sometimes we put hard decisions on diverse folks because you have to be the one to do it. But now that it's out, it's well received. Do you feel like, yeah, I'm glad, or I shouldn't have had to?
All of the above.
Yeah.
Definitely feel like we shouldn't have had to, for two reasons. One, we wish it wasn't so prevalent that we needed to do this. And two, we wish that someone else had already done the hard work. And I think that comment is in the paper too about like, why is this on us? Like, why doesn't this thing exist? You know, and we talked to librarians and we did reviews and, you know, keyword searches and all that. And I'm not like happy about it because like, yay, anti-Semitism doesn't really, that's not really the tone I'm going for.
Fair enough.
But, right? But I'm really happy with how it's been received. Like I said, from the submission process, like I know you said that reviewers are assholes sometimes, but the reviewers on this piece all the way down just entirely were just, again, we had no idea how it was going to land given what the topic was and how we wrote about it. And just from initially sending it out and that feedback that we got of like, it was generally the reviews were like, this is pretty good as is, but like, if you want to do more, here are some suggestions. And the speed at which we started brainstorming at our Nova 2018, started really writing it in January, submitted it end of April. And it was like a quick turnaround. And I think when we submitted the revisions, you guys emailed an acceptance, like, I don't know, 6 days later or something. Like it was really quick.
It was
like,
fast.
So I appreciated, like, I'm happy with the reception because it was clear, like, that JP wanted it from the start and recognized the value of it and was willing to, like, process it. And all of the people that we have sent it to are, you know, I'm big on Twitter, right? And so I'm on Twitter too much. It's fine. But it was a way to get it out there. And a lot of people that I heard from were like, this is great. Can I see it? Thank you for doing this. And so it was a very positive, like clearly, again, there's something in the air that in the field that is like, we need to be having these conversations and we'll take any good tips that we can get on how to do it, whether it's anti-Semitism or other social equity related topics.
Yeah. I mean, I think my feeling about it is thank you. Not being religious, but being a woman, I think that I recognize when someone puts himself out there, and I know how hard it feels to ask people to accept you for who you are, not the work you did. But in this case, like, I appreciate both. It was really well done. I feel like it was probably very hard.
It was. I mean, it was cathartic in a way. And it was a way for us to start thinking about how to even convey this. But yeah, the very issues and dynamics that you're identifying, you know, that's why Jodi and Rachel and I, we had conversations about who should be first author and what that would mean and who wanted it versus didn't want it and who was like, okay, fine, which is basically how it happened. Like, I was like, well, I okay, knowing that I would end up most likely like being the Jew, basically, right? And then, but thinking about it, it is sort of full circle thing where I started in Jewish communal service. Well, I mean, even before that, like started in high school as being vocal and out there. And so like, I should have known that it was going to come out, right? Like you can only suppress things for so long and then they come out in full force. And this is the way that this has come out. Like clearly I'm Jewish, but yeah, it's been an interesting sort of experience to be talking about that. Like, you know, I did ask Rachel and Jodi if they wanted me to figure out if, you know, they could call in or somehow be a part of it. And they were like, no, we're happy to have you do it. And that may just also be in part the topic. It might also just be in part who's comfortable with public speaking and in what ways. But when you post this podcast, like it's, you know, I'm very clearly linked with the article now. So that was some of that trepidation of when it got accepted. I really had no fear of like submitting it. And then it got accepted. And I went, oh God, what did I do? This is a momentary panic.
Well, I hope that maybe this conversation makes you feel less like that is true and that there is appreciation for it and people do want this style of work and it has a place in our field.
Thank you. I've felt that, again, since we even submitted it initially and how it was received and commented on and just throughout as people who've been learning about it. So thank you to everyone in the field who has read it.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.